Alright, welcome back everybody to another video. Today I'm going to be attempting something that is something that I sort of failed to do properly last time, and I feel like it definitely deserves a second look, and that is the New England IPA. Now, what did I do wrong last time? Well, this is a beer that is very susceptible to oxidation, and thus it turns out that it does not do very well in bottles at all. So if you're trying to brew this kind of beer and you don't have a kegging setup, I would advise against it. Not saying it's impossible to do if you have, really good control about how much oxygen gets in the beer, but I tried to do that properly and it oxidized within a couple weeks and turned a disgusting brown/gray color, which is not what we want, and just otherwise was not a very good beer. So I'm trying to do that correctly now. So New England IPAs, unlike Hefeweizens here, they have a haze that is primarily due to polyphenols as well as proteins from the mash. This is mostly proteins, but also there's a lot of yeast in suspension here, which is important for the flavor. The flavor of a New England IPA should all be hops. It differs from your classic West Coast style IPA or your just generally classic IPA by being hazy, by being actually not very bitter, and having a ton of hop aroma and hop flavor compared to that type of beer, and also having a much creamier, fuller-bodied mouthfeel. All of these things kind of come together to create a beer that is, unsurprisingly, very approachable by most people because it doesn't have a high level of bitterness. So therefore, it's kind of taken over the brewing world by a craze. It's just absolutely everywhere. Most breweries nowadays have some sort of New England IPA or hazy IPA on tap, and for good reason. It is not my personal favorite kind of IPA. I do prefer the West Coast classic style a little bit more, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to brew something like this. And it doesn't mean that I don't like it. I do like those beers quite a bit. So what we're shooting for is a style that has low perceived hop bitterness, high hop flavor, a substantial haze, and a very creamy mouthfeel. So we're going to get all of those things through different parts. A haze is going to be achieved through having a lot of hop polyphenols from dry hopping, as well as from having a decent amount of proteins in the mash. We're going to be using a lot of high protein malts to achieve this, such as oats and wheat. The hops are going to be very tropical flavored. So with fruity hops, what kind of varieties are we talking about? Typically, you're going to see Galaxy, Mosaic, Amarillo, Simcoe, Centennial's a good one. Citra is usually in every single New England IPA I've ever seen. El Dorado as well, and a lot of the New Zealand hops or the Australian hops tend to throw a lot of good citrus flavors. You want citrus, you want tropical fruit, you want less pine, less earth, less spice kind of flavors. And also of note is that we're adding every single one of these hops after the boil is completed. There's no hops going in before the boil, and there's no hops going in during the boil. They're all going to be a Whirlpool or a dry hop. So that's going to increase the perceived flavor as well as cut down on the bitterness by doing everything post-boil. Also of note is that water is going to be very important in this recipe. Most beer recipes, you don't need to worry about your water. This is one of the ones that you kind of do because you want to get high calcium levels for that really creamy mouthfeel, and you're also going to want to have a good balance of chloride to sulfate. Now, normally in a hoppy beer, a beer that's bitter, you're going to want more sulfates than chlorides, roughly 2 or 3 to 1 ratios. In this case, we're going to flip that around on its head, and we're going to have a higher ratio of chloride to sulfate. That accentuates the malty parts of the beer, which also, again, cuts down on that bitterness and allows those hops to kind of have more of a flavor purpose as opposed to a bittering purpose. For yeast, you want to use a medium attenuating, so you have a little bit of sweetness left behind, English strain typically, because they throw off a lot more fruit esters as well, which contributes to the flavor. And you want it to be roughly like a medium flocculation. We're not super concerned about yeast falling out, but we also don't want it to be a high level of yeast in the beer like this Hefeweizen here, because then you're going to get fruit from the yeast flavors and not from the hop flavors, and that kind of competes in the beer. We don't really want it to compete. So good options are London Ale 3, which is the Yeast 1318, Imperial's A38 Juice strain, which is what I'm using today. The Giga Yeast Vermont IPA is good. White Labs WLP 95 Burlington Ale is good. And if you really just want to use dry yeast, honestly, you can get away with SO4, the blue packet from Fermentis. So all of those are good options for yeast. So today I'm brewing a recipe that's actually a bit larger than usual. I am going to go for 6.5 gallons into the fermenter instead of 5.5. The reason for that is twofold. A, I want to make sure that I minimize the amount of headspace in my fermenter to basically minimize the risk of oxidation. And also because I'm adding something like 12 ounces of hops, it's going to result in a lot of absorption of that liquid. So I want to have a lot of buffer there so that I don't end up with less beer than I want. Ideally, we have 5 gallons going into the keg, but we'll see. So here's our recipe. We're going to be shooting for roughly 1065, 1066 original gravity, hopefully getting us in the neighborhood of 6 to 6.5% ABV at the end of the day. So we, again, keep in mind this is for a 6.5 gallon recipe, not a 5 gallon recipe. So if your system is different, just scale it. So we have 14 pounds of Pilsner. We have 1.25 pounds of flaked oats, 1.25 pounds of flaked wheat, 1.25 pounds of white wheat, and then 1/2 pound of Crystal 10. I originally wanted to use Carapils here, but the shop was out of Carapils, so I subbed with Crystal 10. Both of those malts are going to serve the sole purpose of boosting the head retention even more so than it already is. So we're mashing this at 150 degrees for 60 minutes, just a single infusion mash, and we'll sparge at 170. Should work out pretty well. For the boil, it's going to be just a 60-minute boil with nothing added except at 10 minutes where we add a yeast nutrient dose, and that should be it. So for hops, like I said, all of these are going to be post-boil. There are 3 Whirlpool editions, so we're going to do 1/2 ounce each of Citra, Mosaic, and El Dorado in a Whirlpool for 40 minutes. Then once 10 minutes have elapsed from that, we'll do 1/2 ounce each again of Citra, Mosaic, and El Dorado at 30 minutes in the Whirlpool. 10 more minutes go by and we'll do 0.7 ounces each Citra, Mosaic, and El Dorado. And then we'll let that sit in the Whirlpool for 20 more minutes. So we have a total of 40 minutes in the Whirlpool. So it's a bit controversial holding the Whirlpool for that long. I think most modern breweries tend to do longer Whirlpools on their New England IPAs, and it's fine. I'm going to do it, and if it results in issues, it results in issues, but I don't think it will. Then we're going to do 2 separate dry hopping editions. So we'll pitch our yeast, and then we'll ferment for 3 days. And on that 3rd day, I'm going to add 1/2 ounce each of Citra, Mosaic, and El Dorado, and we'll hold that dry hopping edition in the beer for a total of 8 days. 4 days after I add that first dry hopping edition, which is 7 days after I pitch the yeast, I'm going to dry hop again with 1 ounce each of Citra, Mosaic, and El Dorado. And then we'll hold that in there for 4 days. So there's a total of 8 days of dry hopping in 2 separate editions spaced 4 days apart. At that point, I'm going to probably draw it in, put it in a keg, and we'll drink it as soon as possible. Like I said, this beer is very perishable, so you want to really emphasize drinking it fresh. For yeast, I'm using the Imperial A38 Juice. That is a 200 billion cell packet, so it's good to pitch right into the wort. Should be totally fine. For water, I'm going to be using a relatively high calcium water profile here, so that's going to accentuate that mouthfeel. We're doing 119 parts per million of calcium, 11 parts per million of magnesium, 65 parts per million of sodium, 118 parts per million of sulfate, 227 parts per million of chloride, so you get that 2-to-1 ratio there of chloride to sulfate, and then 36 parts per million of carbonate. And everyone's brewing water is going to be different from what they start with, so calculate your own additions in Beersmith or an online calculator, and you should be fine. I am adding 7 grams of gypsum, 2 grams of Epsom, and 11 grams of calcium chloride to get my water to this profile. So anyway, I've gone ahead and added all the brewing salts plus a Camden tablet to my brewing water. That Camden tablet just gets rid of any chlorine that's in the brewing supply, because that will ruin the flavor of your beer. So I treated my sparge water as well as my mash water with the water profile. This is the first time I've done that. I realized I was actually not even thinking about treating my sparge water, which is really stupid now that I think back on it. But hopefully that makes a much bigger difference in my beers, considering now that instead of 50% of the water that I'm using, it's 100% of the water that I'm using that gets treated. So that should work out pretty well. So once everything is up to temp at 150 degrees, I'm going to go ahead and mash in. Now it is time to dough in. So I have reached my strike temperature, which is actually the same as my mash temperature because of the recirculation system. I'd rather bring the temperature up to the mash temperature instead of having it fall. So I'm gonna go ahead and strike at that temperature. And this very large grain bill, so I'm gonna do my best to get that mixed in sort of better than this. Ah, it's a huge dough ball. Start the pump and the heat. And we'll come back in an hour. So I just took a pH sample of the wort about 10 minutes in, and it looks like everything is in order. pH is somewhere between 5 and 5.5. It's probably going to look brighter on camera because this is backlit, and the pH paper is a bit reflective. Now, I use pH paper because I'm a cheapo and don't have a full-fledged pH meter yet. That's eventually going to happen, but I can't really afford one right now, so we're going to have to wait. So now we're going to collect our wort for the boil. Should be about 9 gallons of wort total, just so we have enough left over for 6.5 gallons into the fermenter. All right, so we got about 5 3/4 gallons of actual first runnings there, which is pretty good, but we really want to get to about 9 gallons pre-boil, so we still have a ways to go. I'm gonna go ahead and start sparging now. My sparge water is at 180 degrees. I'll let it cool down a little bit before I actually start adding it. But we're gonna add that in, let it sit for a while. Hopefully that gives us enough rinsing of the sugars to get us to our appropriate pre-boil volume of 9 gallons. So the sparge water is sat in the mash tun for a little while now, so it's about time to start collecting those second runnings. So I'm gonna start doing that now. Well, we're looking at about 8 gallons collected in this kettle. That's the maximum capacity for that kettle at the moment. So I'm gonna preemptively sparge with 1 more gallon of water, and that is it. And then I'm gonna collect it in this extra kettle that I have here. So this is not saying that I need an extra sparge, but I kind of ran out of volume here. So just take it as you will. It's just me correcting for volumes that I didn't quite calculate correctly. All right, so our pre-boil original gravity sample is on the refractometer right now, and with my calibration settings for a pale colored wort, it's about 1.06, and that gives us about 13.4 brix. That gives us 1051. Okay, so we've officially begun the boil, and we are not adding any hops. I'm gonna come back in 50 minutes, 50 minutes, to add some yeast nutrient, and that is it. All right, so during this clip, I'm just adding a little bit of yeast nutrient. I typically do this for every single beer that I make, and I'll typically do about 2.5 teaspoons of yeast nutrient per beer, and it just kind of ensures that I have a good, healthy fermentation. All right, so now it's time for me to start setting up the chiller. And typically I'll recirculate boiling wort through the chiller system for the last 10 minutes of the boil, and that just sanitizes everything because it's boiling. So we're gonna do that now. All right, so it looks like we are down to about 180 degrees wort temperature coming out of the plate chiller here. We're gonna maintain that for the next 40 minutes. So I'm gonna go ahead and start adding in our Whirlpool additions. All right, so as you can see, I've added the hop spider. That was added during the recirculation process, so it's sanitized now. So I'm gonna go ahead and add the first Whirlpool addition here, which is the 1/2 ounce each of Citra, Mosaic, and El Dorado hops. That's going in right now. We're gonna let that sit for about 10 minutes now before doing anything else. All right, so now it's our 30-minute Whirlpool addition. So that's another 1/2 ounce each of Mosaic, El Dorado, and Citra. And now we'll come back in another 10 minutes for a third Whirlpool addition. All right, we're now about 20 minutes into the Whirlpool, halfway basically, but it's time to add our final hop addition for the Whirlpool, and that's 0.7 ounces of Mosaic, Citra, and El Dorado. And add those in now. Now we're gonna let this sit for about another 20 minutes, let that hop flavor get in there and absorb. We're gonna try our best to keep it around 180 to 170 degrees. And then at that point, we will continue the chilling process and pitch our yeast later. All right, so we finished up our Whirlpool, so it is time to start cooling for real this time. So I'm gonna turn on the chilling water and just kind of at a lower rate. I'm going to slow down the output from the plate chiller itself, and I'm going to slow down the pump. So all of these things in combination are going to help create a quicker chilling process. So once this thermometer here gets down to about 70 degrees, I'm going to go ahead and start transferring over to the fermenter. And well, that looks like that's going to happen pretty quickly. The wort is chilling really fast. I mean, that Whirlpool did kind of dissipate a lot of that initial heat quite quickly. So I guess I'll take the time now to talk about the fermentation. As I said at the beginning of the video, this beer is an incredibly delicate one when it comes to oxidation. We want to minimize the amount of headspace in the fermenter so that we have minimal exposure to oxygen, as well as when we are dry hopping this twice, it's going to involve opening up that fermenter, adding those dry hops, and then closing it up again, which is an exposure to oxygen. Lastly, of course, when we have finished fermentation and we transfer over to the keg, it's going to result in yet another exposure to oxygen. So there's a lot of chance for this beer to turn out in not a great way. It could oxidize quickly. So I'm going to do everything I can to negate that process, but at the same time, it is a likely thing. Kegging really does help a lot though. All right, so the fermentation is going to be your standard ale fermentation, fermenting it at about 68 degrees for about 10 to 12 days, and that should really take care of everything. Fermentation, however, is going to be a bit complicated by dry hopping. So we are going to do our first dry hopping addition 3 days into fermentation, and that's 1/2 ounce of Citra, Mosaic, and El Dorado. And then 4 days after that, we're going to do our second dry hopping addition, which is 1 ounce each of Citra, Mosaic, and El Dorado. So I don't want to dry hop this longer than 8 days, so I'm going to pull the dry hops out once that time has elapsed, and then we'll keg it probably immediately. Well, look at that, we're down to about 70 degrees. Well, no, that's 68. Well, that means it's time to transfer over to the fermenter and pitch. So I'm going to go ahead and aerate this by splashing it into the fermenter. That's what I typically do, and it has always given great results. Now, oxygenating your wort right now is not an issue. Despite everything I've said about oxidation, Introducing oxygen into your wort right now is not going to be a problem. You want oxygen in there initially so that the yeast have something to supplement their fermentation with. If you have no oxygen in there, you're not going to get a good fermentation. It's after the fermentation is complete where oxygen is an issue. As you can see, I got foam coming out of the fermenter, which means that we got pretty much as much liquid in there as we can fit, and minimal headspace, which is good. That reduces exposure to oxygen. So I'm going to go ahead and pitch the yeast right now. This yeast packet is actually 200 billion cells, so it's like the equivalent of pitching 2 Yeast packets or 2 White Labs packets. So you basically have a full starter's worth of yeast in here. Alright, so for our original gravity sample, we have about 17.1 bricks as measured by the refractometer, which translates to 1066 OG, which is exactly what was predicted by Beersmith. So that is awesome. And not only did I hit a perfect OG, but I also hit a perfect pre-boil OG. So that means that everything has been dialed in exceptionally well. Okay, so it's now about 3 days into fermentation. It's time for our first dry hopping addition here, which is half an ounce each of Eldorado, Citra, and Mosaic. So I've got the sanitized hop bag here. I'm going to put them in. It's not necessary, really, to sanitize your hop bag, I don't think. But I do it sometimes anyway for good measure. We're going to try and get this into the fermenter as quickly as possible and then just close it back up. Like I said earlier, this beer is very susceptible to becoming oxidized quickly, so we want to minimize the exposure during this process. So I'm going to go ahead and put the hops in now. And we'll just cinch that off. And I'm just going to roll it up. Squeeze all the oxygen out of it. And then we'll just chuck it in here. Now this is one of those times where you actually want it to interact with the yeast. It's going to create some interesting flavors, so I'm not even going to weigh it down. And we'll come back in another 4 days and add some more dry hops. Okay guys, it's time for dry hop edition number 2. We're about 7 days into the fermentation now. We had our first dry hopping 4 days ago. Now we're going to add another 3 ounces of dry hops. So this is again 1 ounce of Eldorado, 1 ounce of Citra, and 1 ounce of Mosaic. And these will be left in the, this is going to be left in the beer for about 4 more days. So just like last time, I'm using a hop bag that I sanitized. This is actually a fresh hop bag, so I will have 2 in there at this point. But just like before, we're going to make sure we get all the oxygen out of it. I'm going to go ahead and push that down into the beer now with a sanitized spoon. Alright, so our kegging day is today, and yeah, our final gravity is there at about 10-12. So that's awesome. It's right on target pretty much. So I'm going to go ahead and keg this, and then we'll force carb overnight and hopefully have a tasting for you within the next couple days.
All right, what's up guys? It's now 4 days after I kegged the beer. All right, so when you're kegging this beer, ideally you want to do that under a closed, pressurized fermentation so that the beer never is exposed to anything except CO2. And the best way to do that is if you have a fancy fermenter set up with a ball valve on the bottom or some kind of tri-clamp fitting or a way to move stuff from the fermenter without opening it. I obviously don't have a fancy setup like that, I just have the buckets. But it seems to have worked okay so far, fingers crossed, no oxidation happened. So what I did when I kegged was I made sure to sanitize my keg, and then I actually pressurized and purged it with CO2 until you could physically see the kind of gray, misty CO2 gas in there. And that basically tells you that you have no oxygen in the keg. So at that point then I siphoned out of my bucket fermenter and into the keg. And basically that way the only oxygen exposure was really coming from the actual fermenter itself, but I kept the lid on that kind of cracked, and I tried to take as much beer from underneath the hop bags, which were actually floating on the beer. So I think for the most part we're probably okay. All right, so the beer is about 4 days old, and that's actually about a perfect amount of time for the young beer flavor to fade, and that hop burn that you get from dry hopping and having a young dry hopped beer is a little bit more tolerable now. So we're gonna go ahead and pour it and talk about it. All right, so it's called Smart Pack. So if you watch the Super Bowl, you know what I'm referring to. It's about 7.2% ABV and 15 IBUs.
Alright, so for the appearance of the beer, it's really quite nice. It's extremely pale, very milky haze. It's just got this really straight up orange juice look. The head of the beer is persistent, but it's really nice and white, very creamy looking.
Alright, so for the aroma of the beer, it's just a really very melony. I get a lot of melon and like an orange tangerine kind of aroma. Maybe a little papaya, possibly. Very tropical, very strong citrus, and it really is a very powerful aroma. It's I can actually smell it when it's like over here, you know, sitting off to the side. So that is awesome. The beer really benefited from dry hopping quite a bit, at least on the aroma side for sure. It's a very it looks and smells like orange juice, to be honest. So now for the mouthfeel. Yeah, it's really got this very strong, full-bodied mouthfeel. Very creamy, very thick coating. It is not chalky like some New England IPAs can be. So I'm very happy about that. I did not overdo the calcium levels in this. Yeah, carbonation is, I think I tried to keep it a little bit on the lower side. In my opinion, I don't want my New England IPA to be too heavily carbonated. I think it kind of takes away from the style a little bit if it's too effervescent, because then you get that carbonation bite on your tongue, and it's like drinking a soda. I don't like that. So if you keep it on the lower end, I think it also helps out with the mouthfeel, because then you get more of that creaminess associated with it. All right, so now for the flavor section. Oh, that's really good. And that's coming from somebody that's not actually a New England IPA fanatic. This is pretty good. It is just chock full of hop flavor. There is so much flavor and not that much bitterness. There is enough to balance it, actually, and coming from the Whirlpool, I mean, that does add a little bit of bitterness. It's not harsh at all. It's not like the bittering you would get from a boiling edition. It's just a balance to the wheat and the sweetness you would have gotten from wheat if there wasn't any bittering addition in here, but there's really no apparent sweetness. It's just juicy. It's like straight up orange juicy, which is not a phrase that I thought I would be saying. It's really orange dominated. There's a lot of citrus in this. There's a lot of just tangerine flavor and orange type fruits that are coming through. It's really very juicy, very creamy, and just dominated by those citrus and tropical flavors. Just so much. There is one little downside to it, I think, a little bit. It's not my favorite type of flavor, and that's a slight kind of garlicky note. It's not really that strong, and it's really only there in the aftertaste. But I have read that El Dorado sometimes will give off an oniony or garlicky type of characteristic to some people. I don't think it's really that apparent though, and it might actually be fading a little bit with time because I noticed more of that when it was younger. But yeah, this is like an absolute hop bomb without being bitter. I mean, 12 ounces of hops pretty much that went into this post-boil, and that's the result you get. It's so fascinating to me how you can have such a dramatic shift in flavor and beer characteristics from your hops if you add them in the boil versus a whirlpool versus a dry hop or any combination of those. It really is an interesting showcase to what you can do with hops and with beer. And I think this one really is a very, very good example of the style. So for yeast selection, I'm definitely much more pleased with the way that this yeast kind of backed up the hop flavor, as opposed to the last time I brewed a New England IPA where I used the Giga Yeast Vermont IPA. This time I think the Imperial yeast made a big difference in the beer. It really has brightened the hop flavor so dramatically compared to that yeast. So that's good. The hop combo is just awesome, and I did steal the hop combo from a rather accomplished brewery, so I can't really take credit for that at all, but it works. You know, it works really well. Just equal parts Citra Mosaic and Eldorado, just they really kind of play off of each other in some really awesome ways, and you just get so much tropical flavor out of it. The other thing that's really awesome about this beer is just how fast it's going down. Like, you don't realize that this is 7% ABV. It is super dangerous. I think it's just a really good combination of low bitterness and really great mouthfeel that just make this really feel like it's not 7%. But I mean, I've already put down half a pint of it in probably about 10 minutes. It's very, very drinkable. So hopefully this doesn't suffer from any sort of future oxidation issues. Like I said earlier, if it does, I'm gonna go ahead and put something in the description to tell you whether or not that actually happened. But if it doesn't, I'm gonna go ahead and give this a straight up 9 out of 10. I'm docking 1 point because of that little garlicky type of flavor that's in there. I'm very, very happy to show you that you don't need any sort of super fancy equipment to pull this beer off, other than just being careful about your brewing practices and careful about oxidation. But then again, if I am dead wrong and this thing freaking oxidizes next week, I'm gonna let you guys know. So when I made a New England IPA last year and I bottled it, it really only took about a week to oxidize and turn a brown color. So if you're watching this in the future, you can go ahead and check the description and see whether or not the beer actually ended up oxidizing, and you can determine whether or not my system and techniques were actually sufficient to brew this type of beer. But if they were, that's a good message for all you guys out there who don't have, you know, super fancy equipment and close transferability. So this way I can show that you can make a decent version of this beer with just pretty standard equipment. Just the kegging thing is really the biggest deal, I think. So yeah, overall 9 out of 10 for me on this. Really happy with the final result, and you know, having actually brewed this myself successfully, I'm a little less bitter towards the style. No pun intended. So if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. This helps it kind of boost its popularity with YouTube and helps the channel become more relevant to YouTube. Additionally, if you want to see more frequent stuff, please feel free to subscribe and hit that bell notification icon so you can be notified when I upload a new video. If you want to brew this type of beer, or you want to brew the recipe that I have, it's in the description box down below. And comment down below with your thoughts on New England IPAs, or, you know, doing this with not the highest end equipment. Let me know if you guys have had success and failure. I'd love to talk with you about it all. So in the description box down below, you'll not only find the recipe for this beer, and keep in mind that's a 6.5 gallon recipe like I explained earlier, but you'll also find a compiled list of all of my equipment and links to Amazon where you can purchase it for yourself if you wish to. Just be advised that if you do purchase something through one of those links, I earn a very small commission on it, and it's at no additional cost to you, and it's a great way to support this channel. So I will typically upload to YouTube roughly every 1 to 2 weeks. That depends on how fast I can brew things and how fast I can empty kegs and fill them with those brews. But if you want more frequent updates on content, please feel free to follow me on Instagram. It's at The Apartment Brewer on Instagram, and there you can check out what I'm doing in real time, what I'm actually brewing, and then you can see what's going to come to the YouTube channel later on. So thank you all for watching. I really appreciate your support, and thank you to my subscribers. You guys are awesome. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and finish off this awesome version of a New England IPA, and I will catch you in the next one. So cheers.